Okay, so we're only on the second video in this Drakengard Nier retrospective, and already we have hit what some would call a detour.
When we look at the full list of games that will be covered in this video series, we had the first one on 2003's Dragon Dragoon, which was released in the West in 2004 as Drakengard. We have this video on 2005's Dragon Dragoon 2 with the subtitle Sealed Red Immoral Black, which was later released in the US in 2006 as Drakengard 2. 2010's Nier, even though that video will be diving into the weirdness of the two initial releases of the title, while also covering the 2021 version, which sits somewhere between a remaster and a remake depending on who you ask. 2013's Dragon Dragoon 3, or Drakengard 3 as it was released in 2004 for the American audience, and then finally on 2017's Nier Automata. Obviously, for those in the know, this is hardly a 100% complete look at the franchise, as there are stage plays, an anime adaptation, light novels, cameos, gacha games, and MMO dungeons which factor into the franchise with varying levels of importance.
And there's going to be a pretty sizable hole in this retrospective, with the most recent game in this franchise, 2021's Nier Reincarnation, noticeably missing.
But with that being a mobile live service title, it is now in a completely unplayable state, as the servers were shut down on April 29th, 2024. So obviously, for the purposes of this video series, I will not be able to play that one or even capture footage, so I'm gonna have to let it go for the time being. Even though it should be said that Square Enix has been making some pretty decent choices when it comes to preserving some of its more esoteric titles in recent years. And hopefully, Reincarnation will one day be given the Octopath Traveler 0 treatment, where the previous mobile-only Champions of the Continent was given a modified console release where it abandoned all of the gacha and live service hooks.
Fingers crossed. So in context of all of that, why would this video on Drakengard 2 be considered to be a detour by most?
Why, out of all the games that we've mentioned so far, Drakengard, Drakengard 2, Nier, Drakengard 3, and Nier Automata, is this second entry so often considered to be the black sheep of the franchise and often omitted from the conversation entirely? And the short answer to that is, this is the one entry to feature the least involvement from franchise director, writer, and later creative director Yoko Taro. After the first Dragon Dragoon and later Drakengard released, somehow despite the development troubles, the game's flaws, and minimal marketing, somehow Yoko Taro's first at-bat as director paid off. The game sold 22,000 copies in Japan within its launch week, placing it at the top of the sales charts, and that number exploded to a figure of over 240,000 units in the remaining months of 2003, as the first DoD was released on September 11th of that year. And once it was released into other markets, the game continued to sell, with lifetime estimates suggesting that the game moved somewhere north of around 650,000 copies. Not too bad for a first-time director, not bad for the fledgling developer Kaguya, and clearly Square Enix was happy with this new IP. So of course, with this amount of heat behind it, Square Enix was quick to try and lock down a follow-up. But there was one massive problem. The development of the first game had taken a massive toll on its director. Publisher interference had been constant, feature creep killed morale over and over again, and then there was another big issue. Taro and Kaguya had structured Drakengard the way that they did because they were repeatedly told throughout development that the game was always intended to be a one-off and would never see a sequel. And realizing that they would only be getting one crack at it, that is what caused them to develop Drakengard's branch system and made them lean into all of its insane endings, including the brilliantly subversive ending E. Check out the first video in this series if you want to hear all my thoughts on that, and while you do, please consider dropping a like on this video if you're still here, as it really helps this channel with discoverability, and consider subscribing if you want to be along for the ride as we cover all of these games. But all of that said, once Square Enix saw the sales figures, they couldn't help but change their tune.
They wanted a sequel, but Taro was reluctant, if not outright dismissive.
He did not like what the first game had been forced to become, having gone from being a competitor to Ace Combat, but then being forced to compete with Dynasty Warriors and whatever other niches the publisher would request throughout development. And he was not convinced that he wanted anything to do with a follow-up. But Kaguya at large, including its founder, Takuya Iwasaki, they knew that the company could not turn down the work. And considering the success of the first game, Taro definitely soon found himself in the minority within his company.
With or without him, there was going to be a Drakengard 2.
But before everything was ironed out and the team was selected, Taro reportedly tried to make a compromise of sorts, pitching a concept that saw the follow-up going in an unexpected direction. Taro would work on the next Drakengard if they could lean into Kaguya's, and by extension Namco's, as the majority of the staff from Kaguya had come from there, arcade roots and turn the next Drakengard into a space shooter in the vein of something like Gradius or Galaga. And just as a fun aside, if you've ever checked in on Taro when he highlights his favorite games of any given year, or is just asked about his all-time favorites, or if you've just paid attention to the design choices that he has routinely made throughout his career, this man loves 2D space shooters.
And this Drakengard in space idea, Taro was dead serious, but the rest of the team shot it down.
And so the team for Drakengard 2 was brought on board to develop something of a direct sequel to the first game. And aside from Taro, pretty much all of the leadership from the previous project came back and reprised their roles. Takamasa Shiba came back on as producer, while Yosuke Saito retained the role of EP on this project. Kimihiko Fujisaka came back for character designs, and Taro Hasegawa, who had aided on the original game, took on a bigger role with monster and character designs. But where the first game was written by Sawako Notori and Taro, this time Fuminori Ishikawa took the lead on penning the sequel scenario. Ishikawa, who was best known at that point for writing some of the Dragon Quest Monsters series. Notori is still credited as a writer on the game, but the scope of her involvement is a little unclear, with some sources claiming she was a co-writer, others making it sound as if she were something more of a lore master and consultant, and others still making it sound like she was mostly credited for the writing of certain flashback sequences that are found in Drakengard 2. Flashback sequences that were lifted directly from the first game. But then there were a few roles, important roles, that had to change for this second project. First, the duo of Sano and Aihara, who had been so integral in creating Drakengard's cacophonous soundtrack, did not come back to helm this second project, instead being replaced by Ryoki Matsumoto and Aoi Yoshiki. Matsumoto, who was a Japanese music industry veteran who had worked on Idol records, anime, and even later contributed to video games like Professor Layton and the Diabolical Box, while Yoshiki was probably best known for composing tracks for Gundam Seed. And then most consequential to the development of Drakengard 2, after Taro stepped away from the project, Akira Yusui, who had worked on Drakengard 1 as the head designer and programmer, stepped up to lead this project in his directorial debut. And while Taro would later come on board in the limited role of video editor, like Notori, the importance of this role seems to be fairly limited as well, with it being speculated that Taro really only edited key cutscenes where CG footage from the first game was recycled into this sequel. Reportedly, Taro, who was still working at Kaguya during the development of Drakengard 2, was repeatedly asked for his input during the project by the team at large, but apparently he was reluctant throughout the project. And there are reports further still that a slightly contentious relationship developed between Taro and Yasui, as Taro made some of his concerns surrounding the development of the second game known. But I will dive further into that a little later into the video. And so it was with this revamped team that work on the sequel began in earnest, with pre-production beginning shortly after the release of the first game, and with full production starting in early 2004. Dragon Dragoon 2 released in Japan on June 16th of 2005, meaning that the dev cycle took somewhere in the ballpark of just 18 months to complete. But with Drakengard 1 serving as the blueprint, development reportedly went much smoother than the first time around. Square Enix wanted more Drakengard, and as a result, there was far less publisher meddling this time around, as Kaguya was trusted to make the game. So, with all that said, Drakengard 2 is one of those projects where a lot of the lead artists were shifted around while a lot more of the technical roles stayed the same, and as a result, this title exists in a bizarre sort of realm. Drakengard 2 technically is everything that you would want a sequel to be. The gameplay is far more polished, with the developers being far more experienced and confident in making what had now become Square Enix competition to both Ace Combat and Dynasty Warriors. The textures on everything look so much better, the environments are far less flat and are far more varied, technical problems like draw distances and fog of war are remedied even if they're not completely cured, and the design overall is so much tighter this time around, with better hit detection, a much better combo system, and a camera that doesn't feel downright hostile towards you like the first game. Everything from the dragonflight controls to the hacking and slashing feels noticeably better after just a few moments of testing the gameplay. But with the people behind the artistic choices found in the first game noticeably missing, Drakengard 2 sometimes fails to capture the vibe and, dare I say, the magic found in the first game. Where Drakengard 1 felt like a game made by a team who was rebelling against the conditions the title was being made in, and as a result made something that was dark and angry, flawed but ambitious, and subversive as all hell, Drakengard 2 feels like a game that, while technically far superior in terms of raw gameplay, its story, its music, and even its character designs and overall vibes feel like Kaguya and Square Enix purposely decided to rein in the chaos found in the original while sanding off the more insane edginess found in Taro's outing. Where Drakengard was a game that featured a cast of morally reprehensible characters in a dark and twisted world, Drakengard 2 features a cast of would-be do-gooders tasked with trying to save the world. A world from the first title which by all accounts wasn't worth saving, and a world which became more and more doomed as the original's 5 endings played out. From a plot perspective, Drakengard 2 is presented as a direct sequel to Drakengard. But with the original's 5 endings at play, this second game fits most neatly into a timeline established after the original's first conclusion. As a quick refresher, the central conflict from the first title revolved around a doomsday cult trying to end the world by destroying the sacred seals designed to hold back destructive beings known as the Watchers. We played as Kaim, a sadistic young man who was forced to enter a pact with a dragon in order to prevent the pair from meeting untimely deaths. And the last seal standing between the cult and the end of the world lived inside the goddess of the seal, who was coincidentally the sister of our main character. But in Branch A, the cult led by the possessed child Mana was not only successful in destroying each kingdom's seal, but also in perpetrating events that led directly to the death of the goddess Fyrii. And with all the seals broken, the end of everything was nigh. But after some fuckery and lunacy, Kaim and his pact partner Angelus worked together for one final Hail Mary. The Watchers could be held back as long as a new goddess was chosen to be the vessel for the final seal. And because of Angelus' respect and devotion to Kaim, for some reason, Angelus makes the ultimate sacrifice by becoming the final seal to hold back Armageddon. And Drakengard 2 uses that ending as its jumping off point. At least, sort of. It wouldn't become clear until further games in the series, with Drakengard 3 probably being the most clear on this phenomenon, but the Drakengard and Nier universe is actually something of a multiverse, and every branch that we play off of is just one possible outcome to the events of each timeline. And while Drakengard 2 seemingly follows after the events of the first game's Branch A, and while Nier takes place in the pocket dimension established in Branch E, the implications are further reaching than even that. Drakengard 2 does take place after the events of the first ending of the first game, but it in and of itself is just one possible timeline that was born out of the events of Branch A. Each game may have only a handful of timelines that we get to play through, but it is implied that, like any good bit of string theory, each scenario leads to an infinite amount of worlds born out of each possible outcome. And it really is this timey-wimey bullshit that has led to some confusion. Which ending to each game is the canonical one? Do I need to play the Final Fantasy XIV Automata raid in order to see everything in Nier? Does Drakengard 2 even count? And while the answer to those questions is somewhat nuanced, the quick and dirty version is yes, but. Yes, it's all canon, but everything only takes place in its respective branch of an ever-growing web of side stories and main releases. Drakengard 2 is in the universe, but since it wasn't really born out of Yoko Taro's involvement, it is in a now dead branch, at least at the time of this writing. A potential outcome for one of Drakengard's endings, or at least an outcome that mirrors the events of the first game. Just not an important one as of right now, since Taro has done nothing to reconnect it to the greater project. But with all that being said, Drakengard 2 takes place 18 years after the events of Branch A. The apocalypse was staved off, but where there was once the evil Empire and the less evil but definitely not innocent Union of the first game, the Union has since become the new Empire, and the lands are protected by the Knights of the Seal. But instead of playing as Kaim, this time we play as the new protagonist, Noe, just as he is becoming a fully fledged Knight of the Seal. And it is through this brand new knight that we experience the world of Drakengard 2. He is naive, eager to serve, and even at the outset of this story, it is clear that he is a bit of an outcast. Aside from Eris, who is something of a mentor character towards Noe, a senior knight and his childhood friend, everyone else refers to Noe as the savior, both mockingly and earnestly depending on who is being asked.
My quarrel is with your friend there. First, our former General plucks Dragonchild here out of the wilderness, then the Hierarch calls him a savior. This boy gets on my nerves.
And that is because of Noe's origin. Even though the specifics only get fleshed out later in both the final ending of the game and in supplementary material, at the outset of Drakengard 2, all we know is that Noe was an orphan raised by a dragon. A dragon named Legna who raised the young boy until the knight General Auror found him, at which point he was adopted by the general and raised to become a knight. A knight who, because of his strange origin, possesses supernatural strength when compared to other humans. But before the events of this game even started, Noe has found himself orphaned for a second time after the passing of Auror, who, at this point, has been replaced by the General Gizmor. And right from the jump, it is Gizmor who is in charge of Noe and his ascension into knighthood. So here in the castle, you do all the tutorial stuff. You learn that you have much better camera control this time around, the movement, dodging, and guarding instantly feels light years better than what was available in the first game, and while the short hop, instant air attacks are gone, they have been replaced with damaging light to heavy ground pound strings that let you know that you are playing a more refined version of Drak 1's combat engine. And most importantly, with Drakengard 2 being a sequel to a Dynasty Warriors competitor, you now have an air recovery which was lifted directly from Omega Force's long-running franchise. A franchise who at the time of Drak 2's release was already well into its 5th iterations, as well as the first spin-off with Samurai Warriors. And with Gizmor's first task to Noe, we learn about the improved combat in general. Like the first game, this is still a basic hack and slash affair, but where the first game's strings comprised of lights until a shine would denote a window for inputting a finisher, Drakengard 2's strings are a little bit more reliable and fixed. In both games, longer and more complex chains are made available through leveling up weapons. In Kaim's game, this was treated almost like a rhythm mechanic where you would hack and slash until you decided to end the string with a finisher or the string naturally came to an end. With Noe, all weapons share from a pool of predefined character-specific strings, some that become complex NetherRealm-style dial combos, but each character has a specific AoE finisher across all weapons. So, no matter which one you're using, you will always have at least your basic string, even if the range and speed will differ across all armaments. But specific to this second game, you have a secondary attack by pushing triangle whenever you'd like, and even though it is a little underutilized and mostly there for mixing up inputs for the more complex strings, there is usually some spammable bullshit for the occasional exploit. And similar to the first game, every weapon has a magic attack. Although in terms of raw creativity, this is the first real downgrade when compared to the first title. Where Kaim had access to 65 different weapons, all of which with its own unique magical skill ranging from the broken to the silly to the barely useful, each playable character in Drakengard 2 has a small pool of magic attacks that are shuffled and repeated through each equipable weapon. Some are good and powerful, others are less so, and most are repeats of the same thing you've been using time and time again. But even though the magic here is far less interesting and far more balanced, kind of to the detriment of the raw fun factor, Noe's magic is far more useful as a utility this time around than it ever was with Kaim. Both games feature the chain system. Basically, if you can keep hitting enemies within a tight enough window, a chain count is added to, and in both games hitting certain thresholds will reward the player with bonuses. In the first title, this was the only way to replenish health, as HP spheres would occasionally drop, and a way of easily screen clearing as destructive pickups would alternatively drop as well. In the second game, this mechanic is kept alive and well, but it is a little bit more utilitarian in its design. Some orbs are for health, others are for magic, and gold will drop sporadically in order to play into this game's economy. And always as these chains are going up and up, experience multipliers are added to each enemy killed. But it is how magic interacts with this system this time around that makes it a huge improvement from the first game's design. With Kaim, magic was powerful, but usually ill-advised and sometimes completely discouraged, as most skills would prematurely end your chain since they didn't tally towards its count, and even worse when red enemy types would fling the magic right back at you. But in the sequel, magic can always be used as a sort of chain extension, as when you fire off a skill whether or not it connects, it offers up iframes and a short freeze to the chain mechanics cooldown, giving you extra time to land your next sword swing in sharp contrast to the first game's melee only way of building up that counter. Here in Drak 2, magic is always incentivized, and in a lot of cases, it is sometimes the preferable method of dealing with certain encounters. This game's combat is kind of in a weird place, as are most of the design changes in all other areas from the first title. Weird in the sense that while every change makes this game more reliable and factors into a much more balanced experience, it continuously gives up something that gave the first game a unique wrinkle to play with. In the case of magic, reliability and utility comes at the cost of variety, which makes the game a little less surprising and cool. Dialogue combos are again reliable, but they make the gameplay a little less engaging than the more manual feeling to Keim's outing. And with so many recycled strings again, we lose out on variety for reliability. That seems to be the design philosophy for Drakengard 2 in a lot of ways. Make the game perform far more consistently, but do it in favor for having far more predictable outcomes that sometimes add to the already tedious nature of how fighting worked in Drakengard. That swing and a miss nature to the first game is gone. Your weapons will almost always find their mark, but instead of always feeling like a slam dunk, this refinement lent itself to enemies with far more health, weapons that take even more grinding to level up, and just a little less of that charm that came with embracing the jank. Sure, the dash attack was unreliable in the first game because of how accelerating up to the point that it was available clashed with the game's terrible draw distance, but it was a powerful skill that added some excitement when traveling from one trash mob to the next. And even in that jank, running around in tight circles could be used to exploit that system and get one of these attacks on board early. Here in this game with a much better draw distance and usable minimap, which tells you exactly where the next mob is, Kaguya, instead of tuning the acceleration required or balancing the explosive damage, decided that the mechanic was far too unreliable and 86'd it altogether, and instead replaced it with an again very much useful parry mechanic, which back at the time of this game's release was still on the novel side of action game mechanics, but its inclusion made for enemies that had to be parried as the most effective tactic of dealing with them, which of course plays to the detriment of the chain system, as anytime you are strafing around an enemy waiting to deflect their attack is time that you are losing out on your combo. Again, all of this puts the combat in a weird place, a place where it is noticeably better and far more responsive, but arguably less fun. All while retaining the tedium, but kind of missing the point of the first game's mindless violence. But more on that later. After you've learned the basics of combat from Gizmor and your fellow knights in a commencement ceremony of sorts, Noe is now a Knight of the Seal. We meet some VIPs, including the Guardians of the Seal, who are lords of the different lands and keep the keys of the seal holding off the Rapture, and the Hierarch, who fans of the first game will instantly recognize. And that is Sire, one of the less cursed party members from Keim's retinue, is now the leader of the new empire and sits as the commander-in-chief of the Knights of the Seal. But because of his pact with the Golem from the first title, he is terminally stuck in a permanent state of arrested development, as was its cost, keeping his body permanently in its 6-year-old state, even if his mind is that of someone in their mid-20s now. But before we can figure out the larger ramifications of Sire holding this office or who these guardians truly are, Gizmor is alerted of an invasion of local monsters, and Noe is sent out as a scout for this first mission to drive them back before meeting up with Eris to carry out the operation. And that is where we enter this game's iteration of the Ace Combat-inspired Dragonflight from the first title. But where Drakengard 2's ground combat is in that weird, better but less interesting category when compared to the first title, from a gameplay perspective, flight in Drakengard 2 is pretty much better across the board. Everything feels far more precise and responsive here. Targeting is vastly improved, and even the sense of speed lends itself to these levels in such a way that makes the battles feel cathartic and furious. These sections are definitely a high point in terms of gameplay, but like the first title, flight time is definitely outweighed by time spent on the ground hacking and slashing. But Drak 2's flight altogether feels like a big improvement over the first, except for some changes that seem to be born out of a desire to mix things up over utility. Angelus had a powerful magic attack that could be built up for a devastating screen clearing salvo, and although the red dragon leveled up in changed forms, this attack always remained, even if more opportunities to use it were made available. Now enter Legna. The blue dragon who helped raise Noe prior to the events of this story interacts with this system in a much more varied way. Instead of having magic operate as a resource that is built up through combat, instead, when killing enemies, there is always a chance that one of them will drop a colored orb that acts as a quick pickup that will grant limited access to powerful attacks, similar to something out of Star Fox 64. You've got clear or gray orbs that offer up a single-use salvo that is functionally the same as Angelus's attack, but it does seem to be much less potent this time around. a blue orb which turns Legna's breath into rapid-fire bursts that offer up a decent amount of enemy tracking, a red orb that grants access to an explosive shell with a small amount of splash damage, purple gives you a temporary shield that not only gives you iframes but also allows you to ram enemies by dashing through them, and then the yellow orb is a railgun of sorts that shoots through anything and everything in its path. But counter to the design ethos of No Way's On the Ground kit, this system does feel like it was designed to vary things up more than anything, as none of these limited use attacks ever feel as powerful or dependable as Angelus's ult. In theory, they are more fun, and a few of them have the potential to get you out of a bind or wipe a small group of enemies, but more than anything, Drakengard 2's air combat does seem to lean in on the improved controls and faster response in order to punch up the action more than anything. But then there is Legna himself. Try as he might, Legna represents a huge departure in establishing Drakengard 2's tone. With Angelus and Kaim, there was an initial hatred between the man and dragon, and it was their shared desire to survive that forced them into an uneasy alliance. When Kaim was able to speak, he did very little to hide his disdain for the dragon. And once Angelus was forced to do the talking for both of them, her slithering tone always denoted a certain level of disgust for humanity at large. Legna instead, largely thanks to the scenario and all of the gravitas lent by actor Stephen Grief, he comes across most of the time as a disapproving father, or at times a tired, aging incel.
I am one of the Knights of the Seal, right? That's who I am.
You haven't got into some woman trouble when I wasn't looking, have you? Be careful of women, they'll lead you astray.
Legna, we don't have time. Just fly, alright?
And really, it is here where I have to take a moment and discuss what I think is the actual elephant in the room when it comes to Drakengard 2. From the banter to cutscene direction, from the color palette to the soundtrack, tonally, Drakengard 2 could not be more different from the first game if it tried. The first game was framed as a desperate struggle in a corrupted and dying world. And the second game, while there is some occasional edginess, it feels more in line with what you would expect from Square Enix's traditional output, especially around the mid-aughts when this game originally dropped. Oh, and as a fun little bit of trivia, Drakengard 2, at least here in the West, was actually co-published by Square and Ubisoft, as at the time of release, Ubisoft had cut out a small niche by taking Japanese games and then handling both localization and marketing for them to get publishing rights in the West. Hell, even a first-party game like Ape Escape 2 was published here in the West by Ubi. The more you know, but back to the video. Drakengard 2 is a game about plucky young adults trying to save the world through the power of friendship with a healthy dose of that classic Chosen One narrative. And really, there is a reason for this. As director Akira Yasui once said in a roundtable conversation around the release of Drakengard 3, when the idea of space dragons was being pitched, Yasui and Taro came to the conclusion that if a sequel were to be done, it would have to be a radical departure from what had already been done in the first game. And so, using this logic, Yasui set out to make something that was, in a lot of ways, the opposite of Drakengard. Drakengard was bleak, 2 is hopeful. Instead of featuring a chopped and screwed soundtrack that was made to capture feelings of madness, 2 features an OST which lifts the action with orchestral swells, in a soundtrack that feels like it could have been right at home with some of the more generic entries in the Final Fantasy series. Drakengard 1's combat was born out of what Taro saw as a contradiction in Dynasty Warriors' gameplay. A game that wanted you to feel like a hero out of antiquity, all while you mindlessly slaughtered people by the thousands. And Drakengard 2, with it wanting to be the opposite of the first game, it leaned into the power fantasy of endless combat, in some ways becoming far more like Dynasty Warriors than ever before. And really all of this is to say that where Drakengard 1 cut its identity out of being a game that rejected ludonarrative dissonance by being something of an anti-action RPG, all while abandoning most of the normal genre trappings, Drakengard 2, in its attempt to be an anti-Drakengard sequel, it kind of serves to be business as usual. Drakengard 2, from its art design to its story to its action, all of this feels vanilla. And while there certainly are aspects about the game and its story that help it stand out from being just another action RPG, in its attempt to deny the audience of the subversive nature of the first title, Drak 2 feels decidedly safe. And so, in returning to the plot, once you've become acquainted with the game's systems, both the air combat and the hacking and slashing, and then those weird hybrid levels that let you do both, and again, these are done way better than they were in the first game, even though there are some quirks, but I'll get into them later, it is at least mechanically more solid, as you have the ability to slow Legna down and pick off enemies, and some levels are designed with at least some level of verticality in mind this time around. Once you've been introduced to the mission structure and met some of the supporting cast, Drakengard 2's story and structure is really straightforward. In the beginning, you play as a knight, and you do knight stuff. You kill monsters, you listen to your general, you complete objectives, and you listen to and fight alongside your companion Eris. Everything you do is to bring glory to the Empire. And it should be said that Drakengard 2 handles the party aspect much better this time around. Where the first game was largely about Kaim and Angelus, you did eventually find yourself traveling with one of the most cursed RPG parties of all time. But when it came to gameplay, these additional characters, they only factored in minimally. You would pick an ally to accompany you on any given level, but instead of being a fully developed character, they functioned more as temporary power-ups. You would switch over to them in something that almost looked like a summon animation, and then using each party member was limited by a ticking clock and limited uses. They had their utility to be sure, and in some cases they were absolutely busted, but this felt more like a cameo mechanic instead of a full party experience. In Drak 2, characters are tied to weapons. If you are using a sword or short sword, you will play as Noe, and each kill gets you closer to leveling up that piece of equipment. But if you want to use or level up a spear, axe, or magical staff, you will switch over to each weapon's corresponding character, complete with unique attack strings, animations, and even buffs and debuffs, as every enemy type has its corresponding weakness and resistance. And then when combined with the stakes of each party character's death contributing to an overall mission failed state, each of these playable characters feels far more connected to each level and the story overall. As the party grows, you do effectively have 4 health pools and magical resources to exploit, but by the time the party gets to that size, the game is pushing back enough to make it a necessity. And when it comes to leveling up all 66 available weapons, it becomes a must. And so early levels play out with you switching between Noe and Eris, or riding on Legna's back, even though it should be said that whether you are using Legna for crowd control or mobility, you can only call him when you are playing as Noe. So it does lend itself to this lame dance of switching from Eris to Noe to Legna if you were trying to level up some spears while on the battlefield. And it also should be said that Legna has these weird charge-up attacks that can be used on any enemy on the field, but they are kind of weird because they activate canned animations that are designed to feel like summon animations or something, or special attacks. But in practice, because they only hit 1 or 2 enemies that are close to each other, they have nearly no utility and they only serve to break your chain combos. And so in these early missions, you kill monsters and eventually try to maintain the status quo within the realm. A status quo that has you assisting guardians and keeping the Empire in power. But in an early mission to protect the seal in the district of Soulflame and aid Guardian Zangpo, Noe comes in contact with what will be the major conflict going forward. When you meet up with the Guardian, they are already under attack by a rebelling group of commoners. Commoners who had once fought on the losing side of the conflict from the previous game, the Old Empire. Commoners who have since become sacrificial livestock to keep the seals in power. Commoners who have been oppressed and put to death by the Guardians at the behest of the New Empire. And leading the rebellion is no other than Mana. Mana, who had led the Empire to the brink of bringing on the end of the world 18 years prior while being possessed by the Watchers. A then young girl who is now a young woman trying to make up for the atrocities she carried out during the first conflict. And now operating under her own free will, she aims to bring the now subjected ex-members of the army that she once commanded out of the shadows and away from their oppression. And during a fight with Zangpo, she kills the Guardian. And this event changes everything. Seeing the brutality forced upon these captured people, Noe has a crisis of conscience. But Eris, who is far more steadfast in her resolve of holding up the rule of law, captures Mana, where she is eventually to be put to death by burning at the stake. But, of course, this doesn't take, or there wouldn't be much of a story. And it is at this time where General Gizmore makes his grab for power. In a meeting with Noe, he decides that the young man possesses power that is to be feared and tries to poison our main character. A fate that he apparently already gave to Noe's adopted father, General Ordor, before taking his position within the Empire. And in a short fight, Noe taps into a temporary Super Saiyan form and cuts the general's arm off before escaping. And it is here where the Empire pretty much goes mask off. The General wants you dead, Eris thinks you are a traitor, and before long, Noe joins forces with Mana, deciding to oppose the Empire fully and bring freedom to the oppressed. And so you go from land to land, taking on the different Guardians as boss battles, breaking the seals, fighting the Empire, gaining supporters, and eventually coming in contact with more characters from the first game. And if you are familiar with the first game, then it should come as no surprise that this scenario is more or less the opposite of Keim's mission. You break seals instead of protecting them. And if you remember what the seals are for, it is clear that this game just became morally gray. Or at least it should, but given the team's naivete and some plot twists, our team goes forward on a mission of bringing on the end of the world again, but this time, neither of them really knows what they are doing. And let this be your spoiler warning, as going forward, I'm going to talk about the plot openly, but keep in mind, this is a 20-year-old game, so if you haven't checked it out by now, I mean, you've had plenty of time. And again, this scenario plays into the weird tonal shift from the first title. Despite the cruelty and fucked vibes surrounding the protagonists of Drakengard, they always knew what was at stake and fought with desperation towards saving the world. Here, you play as do-gooders who are on a mission that is always understood by the player, but never by the protags. So it kind of makes Noe and Mana come across as bright-eyed idiots. But the game's rogues gallery does push you through this plot. Gizmor and the rest of the baddies are awful people, and in an inverse from Drakengard, each of the villains is a pact partner this time around. But the things that they were forced to give up in order to fight alongside beasts is treated as something of a moral failing this time around, even if the pact partners from the first game were much worse by comparison. The dead Zangpo entered into a pact with Ifrit, but the cost was his ability to ever be satisfied by food. Hanch, a once beautiful woman who sacrificed all of her charm and beauty in order to partner with Kelpie, and the androgynous Yaha, who now communes with the gnomes, but who can no longer feel pleasure. All of these bad guys offer up decent little fights, and while I will get into discussing the difficulty here in a little bit, almost every fight boils down to looking for openings and exploiting pattern recognition. And while they can be on the basic side, there are a few that punch things up a notch, and every single one of them offers up a far better experience than any of the boss encounters available from the first title, the final song notwithstanding. And even though what I'm about to talk about is hardly a great encounter, it is definitely worth mentioning in the context of the rest of the series. Early on, Noe fights a giant boar, and while it is a straightforward enough battle, basically get the thing to go aggro on you till it charges into the direction of a wall and you could swipe at it until it recovers, it is worth mentioning that out of everything Kaguya did here in Drakengard 2, for some reason this encounter must have had its fans within the company, possibly including Yoko Taro himself, because boars are a bit of a recurring theme in Nier. And this is basically the template for the Mother Goose fight. Chalk it up to a small company recycling assets, or chalk it up to being the one real nod to Drakengard 2 that Yoko Taro has ever publicly made. But the real crowd pleaser comes in the form of a mid-game reveal. As Noe and Mana are breaking seals and killing guardians, their mission eventually leads them to meeting their final party member, Yurik, a pretty boy who opts to wear an intimidating mask during combat and acts as a heavy, tanking damage and swinging a great axe in order to make short work of some of the most fearsome foes. He was once a knight for the Empire, so Noe and Eris both know him to some degree, but he is presented as something of an enigma, with it eventually being revealed that he is undead, and it is only his pact partnership with a Grim Reaper that has kept him tied to the realm of the living. But even more important is the reveal that our group is not the only one looking to destroy the seals. Keim eventually appears, causing Mana to have a bit of a freakout as his presence drags up forgotten memories, and Yurik, who is revealed to be the district's guardian, is forced into combat with the last game's protagonist, leading to what is easily not only the best boss fight of this game, but easily the best moment of this title. Because between the small flourishes like flower petals being kicked up during the fight, and Keim using all too familiar moves against us, while the soundtrack lends itself to the imposing danger of the encounter, seeing Keim cancel into a finisher at the same rhythm as he did when we piloted him, or seeing him fling those familiar fireballs towards us and then using his raging jump attack, this fight is incredible. And I would say that even when we consider the greater Draken Nier catalog, it is a moment that easily stands out in this often forgotten entry. I wouldn't say that it alone justifies the price of admission, but it is Drakengard 2 at its finest. Kaim has been trying to break the seals just as you have, all at the behest of Angelus. While sealed away, he has always been able to hear her cries of agony, and after 18 years, Kaim is unwilling to let his friends suffer in isolation. And when the final seal is broken after defeating Gizmor, who had been operating in the shadows as the final guardian, leaving Eris presumed dead by the end of this conflict, Angelus is freed, but then strikes out on a full-on revenge quest, driven insane by her time as a seal. And so, marching towards the end of everything, you dispatch the Red Dragon at Kaim's behest, as he recognizes that his friend has to be put down. Meaning, of course, that when you do kill her, he will die as well. And in these moments where Drakengard 2 feels directly connected to the first game, things definitely work, making for some impactful and satisfying storytelling. And with the pair gone, we return to the Cataclysm from the first game. And even though the reveal does go extremely hard, with one of the coolest effects I've ever seen in a video game, the apocalypse doesn't feel quite as grimy as it did in the first title. Sure, you still have the red skies, but the floating babies and overall greasiness of the endgame are conspicuously missing, instead replaced with palette-swapped versions of enemies that we have been fighting all game. Except this time around they look like they are straight out of David Cage's Indigo Prophecy. But first, Mana has gone crazy with the revelation of everything from her past being dragged up, so we kinda have to beat some sense into her. As we approach the end, Legna hatches a plan for saving the world. First you fly to the Flying Fortress from the first game, you do your Death Star trench run, you fight some holy dragons who have used this place as something of a library for their secret knowledge, and then you hear a prophecy which more or less outlines that Noe is the chosen one from a new breed, and that in order to save the world, you will have to go to an area called the Promised Land, where you will find an object given to the dragons with the power of the Watchers called the Bone Casket for that final encounter. But before we get to all that, and after we acknowledge the fact that Eris somehow magically survived, as this game doesn't have true stakes, we first need to talk about how this game is structured and what it is like to actually play through Drakengard 2. First, like the first game, Drak 2 has multiple endings. But where the first title had 5 radically different endings that required brief abridged playthroughs, that is, before the final ending require you to get every weapon before seeing it, Drak 2's endings are locked behind 3 complete playthroughs. And these are playthroughs that are designed to become progressively more difficult. And this is also where I have to admit that playing this game all these years later after my first playthrough at release, I made a terrible mistake. When you launch Drak 2, you are asked to choose between 2 difficulties, the first being Standard and the second being Challenge. And while it should be obvious which mode is what, when you read the description for each difficulty, it becomes instantly more confusing with the game telling you that Challenge is the normal mode and Standard is the easier option. And with me being like, well, hell yeah, I've played a video game, I chose what it turns out is the hard mode for my first playthrough. And while it certainly isn't hard to the point of it becoming a problem, it did make the game considerably more grindy, as every enemy took considerable time to chip away at, and their hits did sizable damage. But between the chain system being as improved as it is, and with the inclusion of consumable items being purchasable from vendors this time around, it was never so much of a problem where I thought about restarting my playthrough once I became aware that I had accidentally chosen a starting mode that I would never recommend to anyone else. If you are thinking about going through a Drakengard 2 playthrough, start with Standard, and thank me later. In theory, the progression is supposed to work this way. Play the game on Standard until you see credits, and then when you launch Branch B, the game will force you into Challenge. And then in the final playthrough, the game pushes you into a new mode known as Extreme. For me, I unfortunately had 2 Challenge playthroughs, but that made my second playthrough considerably easier, as I was way better equipped and familiar with the game through its second playthrough. And then Extreme, it is what it is.
A scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not so extreme and 10 being extremely extreme, I give this a 9.5!
Basically, this mode punishes mistakes with big chunks being taken out of your life bar, so you have to keep your chains up for the bonuses, keep your potions on deck, and be ready to switch out your characters at a moment's notice. And it should be stated that even though it breaks continuity, every playthrough after the first allows you to have access to all 4 cast members for every single mission. And this is a welcome change, because with Yurik getting murked mid-game and Eris really only being in your party for the beginning, this is the only way for you to have any real mileage with these characters. But with this game's difficulty ostensibly being slider based, I mean there are no unique enemy types or even enemy behaviors, the challenge comes from taking more damage. And the way that they went about making the bosses extreme was basically give them the ability to one-shot you. It should be said that by this playthrough, you should be well aware of each boss's attack patterns, but if you get sloppy,
Retreat!
And another thing to consider about each of these playthroughs is rewards and experience stay the same. There are eventually ways to get around this, and there are some extra expeditions or side missions that aid in the grind. But killing an enemy that gave you 6 EXP in the first playthrough will continue to give you that amount until you get access to some late game equipment. But it should be said that this time around in Drakengard 2, there are some real quality of life changes. First, leveling up in Drak 2 actually matters. Kaim would only get access to more health and MP as he made his way through the grind, and weapons were the only way to augment damage. Here, a level 1 weapon will still be considerably weaker than its level 4 counterpart, but at least this time around, your base stats actually matter and they grow as you level, making it so that your damage floor is constantly scaling up. And then there is another appreciated change which comes into play in the moments where you actually do die. The checkpointing in Drakengard 2 is pretty much non-existent, and you will be forced to the very beginning of any mission that you die during, but if you decide to retry, all of your experience from that ruined run does carry over. It's not a perfect system, as you will not be able to leave the level and get more healing items, or save for that matter, as the only way to keep this bonus is by hitting retry and locking yourself into another playthrough of the level, but the weapons you leveled up will stay leveled, and so will your characters. So it doesn't feel like a complete waste of time when you do die on a level, even though I'm pretty sure that any gold you get in each attempt is forfeit when you die. But that does bring us to a system that feels a little undercooked. While acquiring every weapon in Drakengard 2 is not a prerequisite for seeing every ending this time around, they do serve to break the monotony of combat by constantly shifting out your point character. And if you have anything of a completionist streak like I do, you will probably find yourself constantly cycling into new weapons to level up as many as you can as fast as you can. But a lot of these weapons and accessories need to be purchased with gold found in each level. But the economy in this game, it feels like trying to get ahead in America in 2026. As the prices for some of these weapons, and especially an accessory like the Glory Orb, which boosts the experience you gain by 30%, getting these feels almost cruel to obtain when you factor in the hours of grinding it will cost you. It should be said that completing the game on any difficulty does reward the player with a generous amount of money to be spent on the next playthrough that will make this process a little bit faster, but even if it does take care of some of the heavier price tags, you will still find yourself in the endgame playing through the same level to grind over and over again if you are trying to get your hands on everything. But just playing through the game 3 separate times with a pretty flat difficulty curve outside of the boss fights already feels like a hardcore grind. And this is where I started to find myself losing steam with Drakengard 2 and being less charitable with its design philosophy. I've already stated that there are aspects in which this game steamrolls over the first in terms of raw gameplay, but as you go through the same levels over and over again, the weaknesses become more and more glaring with each passing hour. The shared pool of magic attacks and finishers becomes more and more rote, the story becomes less and less impactful, and it needs to be said, outside of the endgame, each playthrough is largely identical to the last. In Kaim's game, the branch system always kept things concise, and even though there was a lot of overlap, new story and new scenarios kept the recycled environments and enemies fresh. And in 2026, with the rest of the Draken Nier games as context, they have all handled this branch system with increasing levels of sophistication. Nier completely recontextualizes itself with each playthrough, and those playthroughs skip a lot of the earlier content. Drakengard 3 is a continuation of the branch system as it was shown in Drakengard 1, but with radically different contexts each time around. And Nier Automata does a lot to change perspective, gameplay, and even goes as far to feel almost like its later branches are something of a pseudo-sequel to itself. Here in Drakengard 2, 99% of the final playthrough is identical to the last 2 runs, only with marginally different endings. But with the context of the rest of the series and so many years between my first run through of this game, it was something that I had largely forgotten. And so, like a dummy, I was afraid to press skip during cutscenes, looking for slight remixes or changes in the narrative each time one would play. But no, they were always the same. And again, with this repeat viewing, you start to notice shit. The stilted pacing becomes more and more unbearable. You start to notice how many cutscenes are comprised of largely static 3D models standing completely still while talking to each other.
Eris, I'm so glad to see you again.
Hierarch Sere took good care of me. You think I would die like that? Don't be foolish. There's no way. When I die, I want it to mean something.
You start to see the seams on relationships and realize how very little this game seems to care about suspense or foreshadowing. And seriously, why does Noe somehow find himself in a stupid love triangle? And why do the endings more or less make this feel like a power fantasy that is also operating inside of some bland harem anime? If Drakengard 2 has one major failing, it is this need to try and borrow from the branch structure without doing anything interesting with it, while also lacking a real understanding of all of the work that the team originally did to stop it from killing the pacing. And no matter how many costumes you throw my way for completing playthroughs, costumes that require you to give up the sole accessory slot to wear, a slot which has infinitely more utility loss by doing so, those rewards are never going to be enough to justify the slog that this game becomes as you push forward. And that flat difficulty curve, it basically makes it so no matter how leveled up you are, no matter how good you are at the game, you never really truly feel powerful, and I think that is where the grind feels most merciless. Drakengard 1 made you grind, but then it made you feel endlessly stupid in doing so, as getting every weapon just to reach Branch E was rewarded with a final encounter that didn't even put a single weapon to use. It was a cruel mechanic and a cruel joke, but at least you found yourself laughing at it, speechless at the raw audacity that the developers had. During this relentless grind where you just repeat the same actions over and over again without any type of commentary, subversion, or even cruel joke to reward you, every single blemish just gets magnified. Why do Noe's legs move that way while he's running? I mean, they look fucking broken. Why do the portraits on the save screen look so goddamn mopey? Why does Noe sound like he is on trazodone during every chapter's opening monologue?
The instant the royal duel was over, we were sent on a mission. A mission to defend the District of Shining Life.
All of these things come into sharper focus with each playthrough, and so much of the stuff that felt new and fresh during my first playthrough just started to melt into the background. Drak 2 tried to step up from the first game in terms of gameplay, and they did, but this grind isn't worth it. Sure, they figured out how to get allied soldiers on the screen this time, but by your third playthrough, you realize that this is only a half-assed attempt at scope, because not only are the friendly soldiers brain dead, but they are only present in the opening levels, something to make the impression of a new and improved system before quickly abandoning it. And really that's why Drakengard lends itself to this but that breakdown that I gave earlier in this video. Sure, things seem better in just about every facet of gameplay at first, but as the grind keeps going, you start to become more critical of the trade-offs that Kaguya made during development. Sure, there are pretty skyboxes in the dragon levels, sure the combat is so much more responsive, sure there are amazing bits of music, sure some of the flavor text this time around for the weapon stories can be fun, with one of them being confirmed as a metaphor for how Yosui and Taro would constantly be at each other's throats during development, and sure, the overall performance is light years ahead of the first game. But to what end? Because the more time that you spend with this game is more time that you realize that it is not built on a solid foundation. And once you finish Drakengard 2, you realize how little impact all of the improvements actually made on your experience, especially when they are undermined by this relentless grind. And you start to realize even more thoroughly that there was never even a good reason for this grind other than preserving a feature that was popularized by the first title. In Branch A, you realize that Legna has plans for Noe and his status as a member of the new breed. You go to the Bone Casket, which is functionally one of the Seeds of Resurrection from the first title, but here it has remixed abilities. And it is here where Legna tells Noe that he is to become a weapon for all dragonkind, that he is to aid them in fighting off the gods who will soon be descending upon Midgard. Noe says that he doesn't want to, and wants to restore the seals in order to maintain the status quo. Legna gets mad and tries to beat your ass, but eventually gets tired of it and flies off to join with the other holy dragons in order to fight off the gods. Noe realizes that humanity is doomed, apologizes to Mana for failing, and once she kisses him for some reason, he goes Super Saiyan, and then you have this bizarre air battle against your friend that plays like a bad Zone of the Enders fight, and once you emerge victorious, it is revealed that Eris has decided to become the next goddess. And in a flash forward, you find out that she has been stuck living out the rest of her life in isolation, but racked with guilt, Mana and Noe are unable to pursue their relationship. Branch B shows Noe agreeing with Legna and deciding to become the savior, but the Bone Casket rejects our hero and instead takes over Mana, turning her into this run's corrupted boss. So you have to kill your would-be girlfriend, and this run ends with Eris and Noe joining the dragons in what is certain to be a losing battle against the gods. And then Branch C is basically a remix, which features all the plot points from the other endings. But this time you get to keep both of your girlfriends, save the world, kill the dragons, and stop the gods because Mana was strong enough to absorb the Bone Casket's powers. And I'll tell you this game would have been so much better off if it just jumped directly to ending C. Branch A and B feel like they wanted to feature some of Drakengard's bleak tone for street cred more than anything. But this is in a game that had already abandoned the darker tone of the first game time and time again, as denoted by even trivial things like the kill counter featuring a dragon this time around instead of the raven which implied the carrion-pecked corpses of the fallen enemies. Drakengard 2 is a game that wants you to feel like it has stakes, but it always pulls its punches. Eris didn't die when she was basically shown to. You weren't actually ending the world, even though your actions were the same that doomed humanity in the first game. There just happened to be a Deus Ex Machina this time around. And the mindless violence from Drakengard 1 that was punctuated by a soundtrack that made you feel like you were just another insane man in an insane world is replaced with a high fantasy, power fantasy that ends up feeling more like a grind for the sake of grinding and being able to inflate playtime. And even late game reveals such as Legna the Blue Dragon actually being the same Black Dragon from Drakengard 1 who entered into the pact with Inuart and ate Kaim's parents, or Inuart and Fidei somehow immaculately conceiving Noe and the Seeds of Resurrection at the end of Branch A fall upon deaf ears. Or at least it did for me. Drakengard 2 does as much as it can to make itself feel connected to the first game, but it does so in a way that makes it feel like it wants to be neat about it and wrap up everything too cleanly while only threatening the stakes that the first game had. But I will say this, if the goal was to create something that was the opposite of Drakengard 1 in order to challenge the audience, if it was always the intention to improve upon the game while undermining what the first did, then I think Drakengard 2 did everything it set out to do. I know it sounds like I'm shitting on this game, and to a certain extent, I am, but I did have my fun with it. Just most of that fun and wonder was reserved for my first playthrough, and as the game went on, I found it more and more grating. But I'm not a quitter. I saw everything this game had to offer and then some, and I even maxed out this title's in-game timer. Drakengard 2 is a perfect sequel if the intent was to make a better Ace Combat meets Dynasty Warriors while featuring a competent but generic RPG story. If that's the goal, Kavia did that in spades. But if this was a game that was meant to build upon the aspects that made Drakengard 1 a cult classic, if this game was meant to make you feel like you were getting back into the world and headspace ironed out in the first title, by that metric, Drakengard 2 is a complete failure. And honestly, I can see why it has gone on to exist only in a dead branch of Yoko Taro's universe. That's going to be it for this video, and if you made it to the end, thank you for watching. Drakengard 2 is a weird game, and even though I definitely don't have the strongest opinion on it myself, I know this title has its fair share of supporters. And if you are amongst them, please feel free to let me know why you feel this game gets a bad rap. That's going to be it for part 2 of this series, and I hope to see you in the next one where I cover Nier. And while I won't spoil anything, this series only improves from here on out. If you like this video, please consider dropping a like, a comment, and if you want to join me for the rest of the videos, please subscribe. I hope to see you in the next one, and until then, you are all beautiful people, and I hope you have a great day.